Well, first of all, I hope you'll come back on much more frequently if you can. And I really appreciate you staying up for us. But as a final question, what's the situation in South Africa? What are there countervailing forces emerging, electoral or otherwise, in the South African context?
So the South African political landscape is complicated for a lot of reasons, and it's basically a kind of like the South African left has been moribund for a really long time. I think the reason that's the case is because the biggest sort of working class organizations, the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, as you've mentioned, have been hitched to the ANC through the tripartite alliance and are no longer rooted in actual working class expression and activity. So it's now a matter of there really is no visible and strong left that exists in South Africa. It's scattered across different social movements, or it is following sort of the economic freedom fighters, which is this political party which claims to be left, but it's really this kind of economic nationalist formation that is trying to sort of entrench some kind of indigenous capitalism in South Africa and wrestle control of the economy away from international finance capital and white capital. So the South African political context is very complicated and difficult. And what's interesting about the South African political context, and this is where I think Alex's piece is interesting, is that in sort of like the media landscape, it still adopts a lot of the American frameworks and tools of understanding our political situation, which I think often just lead to confusion and obfuscation of the real problems that we are facing. I agree that, the one advantage that I think the South African left has, which can make us a little bit more bold in our assertion that class is central to the struggles that we wage, is that being a majority Black country, it's obvious that the people who will disproportionately benefit from redistributive programs are Black South Africans. And I think that the task for the South African left today is to just return to those class politics and to try and assert them bravely and without fear and with devotion, and remains to be seen how that happens and if that happens.
Well, that's really perfectly put. One, please stop taking American frameworks. I would like us to be importing frameworks, and our frameworks don't explain ourselves, let alone South Africa. And I think it's true in the United States. And another one of these kind of incredible ironies that if we have that three options where it's like, okay, let's have white identitarian, reactionary based capitalism, which makes sure that fits with the history of discrimination in this country and fits those things together. Okay, well, obviously anybody liberal or left rejects and fights against that. And then this, the neoliberal, it's fine. We can have mass immiseration and whatever, but we need to have 12% of the 1% needs to be African American and whatever. The incredible irony is that a properly working class movement in this country, and I know that everybody knows what I'm going to say, but it's like, because of the history of how we've racialized capitalism in this country, and also just because of the many, not the few, would actually necessarily be, in terms of leadership and composition, infinitely more substantively diverse across every sector than what this sort of like neoliberal pivot is showing. So it's the incredible, that's a way in which South Africa, because the class dynamics are more stark and you actually do have a liberation party in government, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. But in the United States, it's like, if you had a proper mass-based class politics, would be the greatest ushering in of substantive leadership diversity this country's ever seen, and infinitely more than what anybody else is putting on the table. It's another kind of, and would be I mean, it would be so beneficial because of the diversity along race and gender. It would also have a class background diversity, which we never discuss. So it's incredible the knots that our liberal classes have twisted us in to not get to even the substantive realization of the goals that they're constantly banging on about.
I guess, I mean, my question to you, I mean, like, what's your, I haven't been paying as much attention. I mean, I've been embracing this idea not to embrace American frameworks. I haven't been paying much attention to sort of the trajectory of the protests so far. I mean, in what direction do you think it's going?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I actually think the distinction that I would draw is that I think the real, democratize, defund, demilitarize, that is very hard and very far off. Although this is tricky because I don't want to kind of it's like the thing with Bernie. Like Bernie did change the conversation. How important is that? How sustainable is that? I don't know. So like the conversation has absolutely been changed on policing. And that's because of people physically risking their lives. It's also had these incredible anomalies that are amazing. Like 53% of Americans thought it was cool that the police precinct where the murderers of George Floyd were was burned down. Okay, that's cool, And then absolutely we are rushing to co-optation, to HR politics. It's also, I think, without Bernie being here, it's setting off another wave of just, disgusting online toxicity and these just utterly embarrassing toxic games people play here. And, these obsession with personality and destruction. It's just, it couldn't be more sick and awful. I think actually in the middle of all of that, which is less sort of trendy, but I actually think is quite important, is there is a politics that I would say flows from the 60s that is really just like substantive liberalism and is actually really quite important. And it's not, it is not going to get to the class dynamics that overall, of course, need to get incorporated in if you want to really, do something radical with policing. But it's also not all of this kind of woke class politics and online trash. It really is actually, the substantive pushback on what has been a reversal pretty much as soon as the civil rights era, acts were passed, like the assaults on the Voting Rights Act and things like that. So I think there's actually some people involved who are looking very specifically at substantive legal reforms, which are and potential budget cuts, which are really, really important. And so I think Shama Sawant is actually an incredible instrument of this. And it's very interesting because she criticized Minneapolis. She said, whatever, you disband it, but you're going to study it for a year and it will just go away. And maybe I don't know, maybe she's not being charitable, but it's very interesting to me that partially because she's only one person on the council, so there hasn't been big headlines, but this is one person who's saying like, no, you're not, like tear gas is done. And even things like community oversight, which people have objected to me talking about in the past. Toothless community oversight is toothless community oversight, but substantive, actual democratic power over there's a reason there was a cop riot against David Dinkins in 1992 when he tried to do that. Like a literal cop riot, not like the ones we've seen the last couple of weeks where they've been terrorizing protesters. They themselves were actually rioting. So I think those are sort of the three directions. I think some people are definitely getting radicalized and there's a fuller expression, and that's down to the grassroots. Then there's definitely a new proliferation. We're back to all of this trash woke politics, which is just awful across the board. And then I actually think very in the middle that is not getting enough attention is really just even what the Democrats put forward. It's totally insufficient in terms of the overall picture, but some of it is like, yeah, these are actually, there's some solid small reforms that should have been done decades ago. So that's kind of how I see it.
I think
Yeah.
what's interesting, I mean, to sort of come back to the South African case,
Yeah.
when we think of how do we try and reform policing in South Africa, I think it's very clear in the South African context that we're not going to we can't push for a defund the police demand, because our police forces are already being defunded through austerity. And a lot of, something that I say to a lot of my fellow South African comrades, just given how, incompetent and corrupt our police forces are, is that a lot of the modest reforms that are being proposed in America would go miles in South Africa. And that really, something that I try to push in the circles where I have some modest influences, to say that, a lot of people are trying to embrace the American rhetoric of defunding and disbanding and abolishing the police. And I think a much more effective strategy would be to sort of emphasize the provision of the social programs, which would guard against crime and disorder proliferating in the first instance. And to me, that strikes me as a much more viable path when it comes to trying to persuade people to what you're in support of. And I think that a lot of what I'm seeing now in terms of defunding the police is drawing attention to that by saying we need to think about how budgets are allocated. But I think that you can talk about emphasizing the provision of the social programs, and that's more appealing. And then answer the how will we pay for it question by saying, well, we pay for it by defunding the police.
Yeah, I think that that's also true, because even, the way when those cuts start getting talked about, and I'm very concerned that if you don't immediately frontline, like, you're going to cut this police department in half, and we know exactly to the line where it's going in terms of education and healthcare and so on. If it doesn't do that, then it will just evaporate into more austerity, which they want anyways. I think you're totally right about that.
It's to say something. To say something else about this, one thing that I think I wouldn't say worrying, but it's concerning that the Bernie campaign kind of ended very recently, and it feels like it's been relegated into the far corners of people's consciousness. And I think that this is a fertile moment to connect what Bernie was proposing to what everyone is starting to propose now.
I agree with you completely, and unfortunately, there's the liberal contingent that see this as some type of repudiation of Bernie, which it's very much not. The other difficulty again is just in the types of things that get conflated. Like, another thing that comes up is the very, I think, just obvious and sensible that the idea that police are deployed when somebody's having like a mental health issue or something is ridiculous, and that's a reform that can be immediately changed. Or and also the paradox we've talked about on this show, which is not, it's not in line with the sort of trendy rhetoric, but something that definitely emerges from opinion polls and actually sort of reporting thing, which is like the paradox of neighborhoods that are the most deep and systemic victims of racism and class-based harassment and ongoing broken windows policing, and just absolutely terrorizing people for drinking a beer where that would be completely ignored in a predominantly white middle class neighborhood. This is happening all over the country, and so this is a basis upon which people are uprising along with the murders. And then at the same time, when you dig into this, that paradox that actually, well, there's other areas where we feel like you're not taking murder or rape actually seriously, like you're not actually looking into these things. It reminds me of President Lula was confronted on, some crime statistics going up when he was president. And he had this interesting, he said, ridiculous. The difference was that we counted crimes that occurred in the periphery. So this was always happening, but we were going to document that if somebody got murdered in a favela, that mattered, that needed to be investigated, that needed to be noted. So I think that there's a lot of, and then there's a whole other question about punishment and so on, which I think is also, again, an extremely important one. that maybe could get disaggregated between policing and prisons. Like, because to me, like the function of policing, I don't see how, even if you call it something different, there'll be a function like that. But prisons, it's interesting because maybe it's like, look, there might be always a function of keeping somebody who is literally unsafe to other people sort of away. But the idea of, just this like function of punishment being interrogated, punishment for punishment's sake. I mean, I think that needs to be deeply interrogated. I would probably have a pretty close to abolished position on that. And they're part of the same continuum, obviously, in terms of racism and class and the revanchism of the suburbs. But in some ways, to me, practically, they start to actually pose very different questions in terms of like the renaming and reframing and change of things.
That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah.
William, will you come on again soon, brother?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot to unpack, but this is a great conversation.
I'd be absolutely happy to come back on. Thank you so much for having me.
I really appreciate your time. And please, everybody, read Africa as a Country. It's a fantastic, really, really good site on not only politics. You guys actually have extensive film, sport, art coverage. It's just an excellent website. William, I thank you so much. Stay safe and well.
Thanks very much, Michael. You too.
Take care.
Cheers.
Cheers.
You just watched a Michael Brooks Show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.